Welcome to Who We Become Life Beyond Change. I'm your host, Amanda Lentz. This is a space for honest conversations about identity, resilience, and what it really means to rebuild after life changes. Here, we share stories of loss and hope, of challenge and courage, and of becoming someone new, even when life doesn't go as planned and the future feels uncertain. Whether you're navigating illness, grief, transition, or simply searching for meaning after change, you are not alone here. And I'm so glad you're here. Let's begin. There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after. Sometimes they arrive quietly, and sometimes they arrive in a single, shattering instant. Today's guests know what it means to live inside that kind of before and after. Abby Maslin's life changed when her husband was violently assaulted and left with a traumatic brain injury. What followed wasn't just a season of medical recovery, it was a season of reinvention, of marriage, of identity, of learning how to love someone who is both the same and profoundly different. But what moves me most about Abby's story isn't just what she endured, it's how she chose to stay, how she chose to love, and how she rebuilt herself in the process. Like many women, I've experienced how quickly life can reshape who we are, and how quietly that shift impacts how we lead. Abby's journey invites us into that quiet reshaping. Today, we're talking about caregiving inside a marriage, the grief that can coexist with devotion, and what it really means to become someone new when the life you knew no longer exists. This is a conversation about resilience, but not the shiny kind. It's about honest resilience, the kind that asks, who am I now? And who am I choosing to become? I am so honored to welcome Abby Maslin to Who We Become. Abby, thank
Thanks.
you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thanks for having me. That was just the most perfect summary of a transformational experience. Just well said.
Well, I'd love to just start at the beginning.
Yeah.
Um, we have these moments where we look at our life from before and after. So what did before look like for you?
Yeah, that line about the before and after is actually a sentence that is in my book, Love You Hard, which is about this experience I'm going to share today. And that is truly how it felt like a dividing line. So on the before side, I was the mother of a 2-year-old and almost 2-year-old. I was a teacher in the public school system, and I had been married for just a few years. And I was in that kind of magical moment of just possibility for what life could look like and just learning to savor all of these novelties about, becoming a true adult in that sense. And my husband was, at a baseball game in our hometown of Washington, D.C., and he did not come home one night. Um, and for hours and hours, I waited for him to come home and his phone was dead. And, my brain started to imagine, something terrible must have happened because here was a really responsible man. Like he had pretty much had to push him out the door just to go to this
Right.
baseball game with his friends. He had been neglecting his buddies ever since he had become a dad. And what had happened is that he had been assaulted on his way home, on his walk home, and robbed of his cell phone and wallet and hit over the head with a baseball bat.
Oh,
So during those hours that I was, wondering where he was and starting to imagine all the possibilities, he was actually lying on the street only 6 blocks or so from our condo. He had knocked door to door asking for help, but it was the summertime and nobody was home, and he collapsed on somebody's doorstep. So he was not found till the next morning. Um,
oh,
and the timing of this all became just it's imprinted in my mind forever because these are, this is your before and after moment. But I called the police when I woke up to report him missing. And after a few hours, discovered that he was at a hospital, checked in as a John Doe, and had sustained a major traumatic brain injury, for which it was unclear whether he was going to make it.
oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that kind of emotion, especially as a young bride, a young
Yeah.
mom, and just not knowing. And
I think the refrain, and I'm so sorry to interrupt, Amanda. I think the
no,
refrain is that was just repeating in my mind that morning was, "This can't happen to me. This can't happen to me." Um, and I think that's what happens to all of us when we are in a moment of trauma or shock. It- we tell ourselves so many stories about how we're safe and we're different from other people and we'll never be those people on the news and it can't happen to us, and then we discover we are just vulnerable humans and these things, they just happen.
with no rhyme or reason, and
Right.
I think it gives you a different perspective, which I think we'll get into later. And so,
Yeah.
in the earliest days, after your husband's assault, when everything was uncertain and you were still navigating the unknown, what did you learn about yourself that surprised you?
Mm. I learned how protective and loyal I was. So immediately I went into the mode of I need to act as my husband would in this moment. If he were not in a coma right now, what would he do? So I was putting myself in his brain right away. He was the really responsible one in the sense of he was really cautious and he liked to be prepared for all kinds of situations. And I was the more spontaneous, impulsive partner in the relationship. And so I really knew that to survive this, I was going to have to adopt his mindset. And I wanted to honor his wishes about what he would want done in that moment. So, for me, that meant finding a voice with the doctors and nurses who were caring for us, who were all wonderful. But I found that I was like a bit more vocal than I would have been because I was the last one standing. Like, I was the person who was going to have to get this information and try to make sense of this. There was nobody else. I think that was really the moment that I was like, I am officially a grown up. And I know that sounds kind of funny because I was 30 years old, but I'd always had somebody that I could count on
Yep.
to be my net, and I didn't have a net anymore.
It's so funny. I chuckle because I completely resonate with
Yeah.
that. And you're a wife and a mom and all these things that on paper it's like, all right, I'm an adult. But
Yeah.
then until you have to be an advocate, that's when reality hits. So
That's
no, I
exactly
I
right.
fully I fully appreciate that. And it's nice to understand that other people have felt that way also.
Yeah. 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 I mean, that's part of the before and after, right? It's like there's an innocence that's taken from you when you meet a moment like this. Your sense of safety is forever gone.
Absolutely.
You realize that danger has always been there. It's always been present. And then you can't unsee what you've seen. And I think, part of the journey after is figuring out how to live with that information.
Absolutely. And it's hard. It's hard when you get to kind of peek behind the scenes
Yeah.
and behind the curtain and see what's out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And was there a moment, when the crisis mode fades and you've
Mhm.
advocated and life is starting to get back to normal, that you have these emotional shifts? Were there any moments that caught you off guard just in the process of recovery and healing?
Every day. Every day caught me off guard. Brain injury is a really difficult diagnosis and condition because there is I mean, not that there is a guidebook for any illness or any trauma, but it is particularly unpredictable. And so when my husband was in a coma and doctors got to the point where they thought he might survive, they basically told me to expect anything, that he could be a totally different person, that he might not remember me, that he might be aggressive. Like basically it was all on the table. And so managing expectations around that was a daily practice, right? Because he would have a good day and then I'd start to feel like, okay, we've got this, we're going to make it. And then the next day was not a good day. And so not knowing where we were going and like not having any roadmap for will this get better. Um, it was just the most ultimate test in patience because I was an elementary school teacher. I thought I was the most patient human on earth. Like, I really thought I had that mastered. This, a good friend told me at the very beginning, she was like, this is like watching paint dry, and I kept hearing from others like, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And that could not have been more true.
Wow. Yes, and as, my hat's off to you for being a teacher because it's just a different type of patience, I think,
Yeah.
that you have to bring, especially now that you're navigating this new relationship within your marriage. And so what did that look like for you? The rebuilding of the relationship with your husband once you're navigating this new normal.
Yeah, I think it was about this constant check on my expectations. So when he came home after about 3 months in the hospital, I was overjoyed because we were no longer in the hospital setting and we were getting a chance to be together as a family. Our son could not see him in the hospital all that time. So they had a brand new relationship to form because my son really couldn't remember him. He had just turned 2. He was, and my husband came home with a helmet and he was in a wheelchair. He looked like a stranger to our son, Jack. Um, so, at first, I think I was just overjoyed that he was home. And then very quickly, it became evident that I couldn't expect that this was going to be a marriage in the way that it had been, like an equal partnership, that this was going to resemble something different. And in the immediate, it was going to require me to be a full-time caregiver. So I was going to have to help him relearn how to walk and relearn how to talk and write and read because all of those faculties were gone. And I was going to have to do it at the same time I parented my 2-year-old. And
Mhm.
so one of my big fears at the time was just that my son was going to outpace my husband. And I didn't know, how I was going to manage that. Um, so there were just, I think it was just a really challenging moment of figuring out who I was in our marriage and who I was in our relationship because people would say like, "Oh, you guys are home now. We'll watch your son for the night. You can go out and have a date night." And I'd be like, "A date night? My husband can't talk to me. That sounds terrible. That's
Oh,
a horrifying idea." So the expectation that we were going to have a romantic relationship on top of a caregiving relationship, on top of surviving trauma together, on top of trying to keep our lives together, like all those expectations were too much, and I had to learn how to just kind of attack one piece at a time. And that began with just being the best friend I could to my husband and just being his advocate. So maintaining that kind of mindset of what would he want in this moment? What
mhm.
would he think is the next right step forward? Because he really couldn't. He couldn't weigh in on anything, from finances to where we lived. I mean, we had to restart everything. So I really just tried to say, like, what can I do to be the best friend I can to him so that should he get well enough to take over part of his life again, I'll have positioned him as well as I can.
That's incredible. I mean,
Yeah.
the fact that have you have this dual role as a mom with a young child and also caregiving but being so practical and realistic, I think that's just such an incredible story to
Yeah.
be able to share.
Yeah, and I was really proud of myself. I mean, there was this sense of empowerment that I was finding, in this horrible moment of life. I was like, wow, I didn't know I could do all that. I didn't know I could take over all the bank accounts and make everything work. And I didn't know I could take out the trash some of those things were just ridiculous small things, but there was this sense of I can do a lot more than I gave myself credit for. And then on the other hand, I was profoundly lonely. I was married and partnered and without anybody who could really offer anything back to me. And maintaining that kind of illusion of a typical marriage was an enormous burden on my heart because I was so lonely and I wanted to be able to grieve. I mean, my husband was not coming back as he was, and yet I needed to be grateful that he hadn't died. Um, and so that was a really tricky tightrope to walk.
And I think that's part of it that isn't talked about enough
Yeah.
is that intersection of grief and feeling gratitude. And I think it's really, and I don't even want to say brave because that's your feelings, but I just the
Yeah.
fact that you're bringing a voice to that and you are standing in and being able to share how you felt, I just feel like that has resonated or will resonate with so many people who are navigating similar situations and knowing that it's okay. Like other people feel like this.
And I hope it gives people permission to lean in and ask hard questions when they have a friend who is suffering, in some moment of life, because I think people just they wanted me to be okay, and they saw how capable I was on the outside, managing, a husband who was severely disabled and mothering at the same time. And they didn't want to ask the questions about but are you emotionally sustained? Like how is your soul? Um, because the answer would have been something that they couldn't fix. And that would have been really hard for people to hear. And I think the lesson that I've taken from that is to lean in more than I'm comfortable with when I am with somebody who is going through something. To ask the question that might seem offensive, just to open the conversation and just to make sure that that dialogue taps into the reality of what that person is experiencing.
And I think that's such an understated group or an underappreciated group is the caregivers because it's
Yeah.
always the attention that's on the person who's going through it, but then leaning in and supporting the caregivers is, I think, a a discussion that needs to be had, or at least an awareness that you are going
Mhm.
through it just as big as whoever's, this experience has happened to.
I think people know what to do in terms of okay, we're gonna organize a meal train, and oh my gosh, there were so many people who did amazing things for us. I will never ever be able to thank everybody who stepped in and took care of us. There were invisible helpers every minute of the day. And I think even with all that, it is the loneliness of the experience that is so, so isolating. And especially when you're 30. I didn't know anybody who had remotely experienced what I was going through. So it was really hard to find people who were willing to sit in conversation with me about the hard things and to just kind of face the darkness with me.
And so, what would you do? I know with your advocacy work, you're bringing awareness to sharing your story, and you're talking about the messy parts, the parts that are hard.
Yeah.
So, for someone listening who is either in the role as a caregiver or is aware or friends with someone that's in this space, what would you say to them to empower them to lean into those messy parts and have those tough conversations?
Mm. So many things. Okay, one is that I think we discover that not every person in our life can serve every purpose in our life, right? Not even a spouse. And so it was really easy for me in my mind to say, oh, well, my husband is not available to me anymore. He was perfect. He did everything. I mean, that was a very convenient narrative to lean into
Sure.
because it seemed so real in the moment and it seemed so true. But no, marriage was not 100% easy before brain injury, and it never is for anybody. And so, I had discovered very early on in my married life that friends were going to play a huge role because I wasn't going to get everything I needed from one person. But I needed that reminder a lot. So, I had friends that were great at organizing, a fundraiser, and I had friends that were great at organizing the meal trade. And then I had friends that were great at sitting in the dark with me and crying, but not everybody could do everything. And so I had to start granting compassion to others for
Oh,
what they were able to do. And then I had to grant a lot of compassion to myself. And so that is the other lesson that I would ask caregivers to take to heart. It's just this sense of you are not a bad person for finding this difficult. You are not a bad person if you want to run out the door. You are not a bad person for thinking that this caregiving thing is it's just not for you, because there is also this prevalent myth that it's just the most noble position in the world, and since it's so noble, I guess we don't need to really recognize people and or help them out. And that's just it's just this excuse, it's this like martyrdom that we just, we just apply to the caregiving situation, and we do it to teachers too, for that matter. So nobody really asks to be a caregiver. When we stand at the altar and we say, like, till death do us part, or, in sickness and in health,
Yep.
like, we can't possibly imagine what that might look like in its most severe form. Um, and I think that, like, this sense that some of us are just meant to be caregivers, I really resent that because I just don't think that's true. I think we're all capable of stepping up and being great partners. I don't think that means that's our purpose in life. I think keeping in mind, at least for myself, that I had these other skills and these other talents that I was also bringing to the world was really important, because I did not want to just be the caregiver.
Sure. Well, you had a whole identity before you stepped into this
I
role.
had a whole identity. And, my identity as a teacher was an incredibly strong identity. And then within weeks of TC's injury, I started writing a blog about his brain injury, because I had so many people asking me, like, is he better yet? When will he be better? And they didn't know anything about brain injury, and neither did I. So I started blogging about our experience, and then within a few weeks I had thousands of followers, and then I had this identity as a writer, and that was really new and exciting. And I thought to myself, like, maybe this is something that I can do. This is something that I can do for myself, that is just for me. And it's outside of what I'm going to be giving to my spouse and to my son and to everybody else in my life. This will just be for me. And so that I think it's so important for caregivers to have something that they can cling to that is just for them.
Absolutely. And you said earlier just the managing the expectations.
Hmm.
And I think just managing expectations for yourself, for others, and then finding that identity outside of that caregiving role. And it should not be considered, and no, it is an incredibly noble thing to do, but it is so, so hard.
It
And
is
I
so
love
hard.
again that you have really elevated your experience into a way to shine light on that and just allow again people to have a voice to say, look, I was thrust into this role and we'll get through it, but I'm so much more than that.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I'd say the only kind of understanding I had of brain injury before becoming a caregiver to somebody with a brain injury was through like movies like The Vow, where somebody gets a brain injury and they have amnesia, but then they get over the amnesia and then it's all okay. And so I really needed people to know that that was not our experience at the very minimum, but most people's experience
Right.
with brain injury. And I really, really, really wanted people to understand just what a difficult um, experience brain injury is, and also how common it is. Because I had no idea either. When this happened to us, I remember being in the hospital that first day and being like, "We are the first people this has ever happened to," and the nurse was like, "Honey, no." It was really helpful. I had so many nurses who gently called me in. But you're so self-centered during these moments too. And how can you not be? Your entire world, like, you can't see past it when
Sure.
when you're in crisis. So I needed those gentle reminders that others had walked this path before me, so that I could read their stories and I could connect with people who had walked down this path. And it became clear to me that, like, if I could navigate this in a way where I still felt like we both had a strong quality of life going forward, that I wanted to be that person for somebody else. If I could find a way to, you know, really, it was about my own brain. It was about reorganizing my own thought patterns. So
Sure.
whenever I talk to people about this, I say, yeah, Leticia's brain got injured, but then I had to reorganize and rewire my own brain to meet his, right? And to meet this moment. So if I could come to this task of, like, finding light in my life and finding purpose and finding a way forward and not faking it, like really genuinely finding joy again, I wanted to be able to teach others how to do the same thing.
That's amazing. And so what does advocacy work look like for you now? Like how are you leaning into that space?
It's a great question. I was very involved in the brain injury community for many years, and I wrote a memoir called Love You Hard that came out in 2019. That's about our experience, and did a lot of speaking around the country and a lot of talking with caregivers and, medical professionals and that kind of thing. And then COVID hit, and I was completely sucked into a different kind of caregiving role, which was trying to navigate that pandemic with my two children and all my students in the virtual
Oh
setting. So,
my
you
gosh.
know, it was interesting. It was like very much a pivot away from caregiving and brain injury in one way, but in another way, I was like, I'm serving. I'm just serving in a different way. And I have a Substack now called Beyond the Classroom. I left teaching a few years ago, but I left it with the sense that I was always going to be a lifelong learner, that my own understanding of neuroplasticity was informed through my experience watching my husband's brain injury, and that I wanted to be on a continual path of learning new things and growing. And that's why I knew I had reached the end of at least my classroom teaching experience. And so I write there weekly with, hopes and dreams and hopefully inspiration for folks about how to rethink and reimagine our lives. And then also how to stay on the path of trying to accomplish our biggest dreams. Mine was to write a book, and I did it. And then it taught me that I love to write. And so now I'm working on several fiction projects. But, that has all been really, really exciting. And it's been a reminder that, like, I have this incredible mind. We all do, even those who have sustained an injury to their brains, where we can learn new things. And for as long as I can take advantage of that, I want to. I want to continue to grow. So that's what my Substack is about. And I feel like that's probably my most frequent form of advocacy these days.
That's amazing. And so when you talked a little bit about, kind of this life beyond. So you have now found a new identity as a writer
Yeah.
and a lifelong learner and
Yeah.
educator. And so when you think about living fully now, how does that look different than
Mm.
before your life had the before and after split?
Well, I think that gratitude is such a big part of how I live now. We're all grateful at Thanksgiving, and we are all grateful from time to time. And we like, don't miss the bus, or like, don't get that parking ticket, or whatever it is. But, um, like, really learning to look at the small moments in our lives from a lens of gratitude is probably the most transformational way that I've changed my life. I try not to take things for granted. Of course I do. I am just a human. And the moment that my life like is on cruise control, I'm like, oh, it's all good. It's supposed to be all good. And then, a hiccup happens and I'm like, oh, woe is me. But I know from what I went through, where one point in my life, my biggest dream was that I was going to be able to wheel my husband through Target. Like, that was a dream for me. Um, I know that anytime our loved ones get home when we think they're coming home, or anytime, our kids get from point A to point B, or we get in the car and we get where we're going and things go according to our plan, like, that is an incredible gift. And so I really, really try to lean into just the awe around that.
Hmm.
Um, I try not to miss it. I was gardening yesterday, and this is like a new thing that I'm trying to learn. This is part of my this year's kind of growth goals for me. And I mean, I just had the most like obvious moment where I was moving dead leaves away and moving, wet snow, and I saw these blooms coming up, and I was like, they survived this horrible winter that we've had here in DC. They've just been waiting underneath. And poets have written about this forever. But to really see it, I was like, this is remarkable that this works this way. And like, if we could all really take that lens just once or twice a day to our lives, I think we would find that we would stop coming from a place of lack and scarcity and start seeing all the abundance that really surrounds us.
Oh, that just beautifully said, and such a helpful reminder just to take a step back from the day to day, and where it's easy to get frustrated, but then when you have been through something life altering, you're like, you know what, it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, right, you still have hard days, but you've
Yeah.
survived a traumatic brain injury as a caregiver, and here you are. And I think it's just, you know you being able to find those moments is just it's just incredible.
We're so adaptable and we never give ourselves enough credit for it. Like most of us come from the mindset of like, oh, that's going to be uncomfortable. How am I going to manage that? We don't, very rarely anyway, look back and see all the times we've managed discomfort or managed pain or whatever it is. We just don't give ourselves enough credit. And so, for better or worse, we are so adaptable. So if you had told me that I could still find joy, in the moment where my husband was ill, both my parents were ill at the same time, it was the trifecta, and that I would still be able to like laugh and have a silly dance party after dinner or any of that. Like, I didn't think that I would be able to manage all that pain. And I did. And sometimes because we're so adaptable and now my life is in such a beautiful rhythm, I've become adapted to that too. And those are the moments where I have to stop and be like, don't be a brat, Abby. Like look at all these good things that are happening. But that's because that's human nature. We adapt. We
Yep,
adapt. But if we could remember all that we are capable of, all we've already proven, I think that we would go into these difficult before and after moments with so much more confidence in ourselves. And I think that would alleviate some of the anxiety around all the uncertainty, because really it is the uncertainty that is intolerable about it.
absolutely. And so, as we close, I just want to thank you again for your vulnerability, for your willingness to step into an advocate role, and to share your story. And I had made some notes, just some things that stuck out around granting compassion to yourself and then
Mm,
also to the others in your life, and being able to recognize that not everyone's going to be able to be what you need, and that's why you have a community, and to lean in more to meaningful conversations. And so, you had mentioned your Substack, but how else can people follow you, get involved, learn about what you're working on, especially with your upcoming books?
yeah. Well, if they are interested in knowing more about our story and about this whole kind of period of transformation, my memoir is called Love You Hard, and you can get it anywhere books are sold. Um, they can also get in touch with me on Instagram, where I am to be found more frequently than I should be. Um, it's Abby_Maslin, or at my website, which is abbymaslin.com. But my Substack is like a place where I love to connect with folks because it's such a generous and just like very positive community. And I think this is a really interesting moment in history we're all living through. And there's so much like conversation and so much noise. And I think it's just nice to have a place where it feels like a community, even if people are not face to face. So I appreciate Substack for being that place.
Excellent. Well, Abby, your story reminds us that becoming isn't about returning to who we once were. It's about honoring the person we are now, even when the path here was never one we would have chosen. Caregiving, marriage, identity, love, these roles and relationships can reshape us in ways we don't anticipate. And yet, there's power in staying present to that reshaping. So, for anyone listening, if today's conversation resonated with you, especially if you're navigating a season of change that feels invisible or isolating, I hope you know you're not alone. You're allowed to grieve what was, you're allowed to protect who you're becoming, and you're allowed to redefine love, strength, and resilience on your own terms. So, if this episode spoke to you, please share it with someone that might need it. Go follow Abby. And as always, thank you for being here, for listening, for reflecting, and continuing the work of becoming. So, until next time, you are not shaped by what happened to you, but you are defined by who you choose to become. Thank you, Abby.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was a lovely conversation.
Thank you for joining me today on Who We Become. I hope this conversation reminded you that growth isn't always easy, but it is always meaningful. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need it. And if you haven't already, be sure to follow, rate, and review the show. It truly helps these stories reach those who may need a reminder they are not alone. Remember, what happened to you is part of your story, but it is not the end of it. You are not defined by what happened to you. You are shaped by how you rise. Until next time, take care of yourself and keep becoming who you're meant to be.